Greetings from the cosmic horror. The stars are right once again, and the great old ones allow us to talk about for 30 plus minutes H.P. Lovecraft, the horror writer who is a genre unto himself. I'm your cosmic host, Mark Griffin, executive of Lovecraft Estate on Joggif, joined in by two from Material World, David Guffey, who is running late, and a professor at Miss Pataki University, and Richard Wilson, who is sporting a nice ashcot to conceal his neck wounds.
It's a classic look.
Yes. Today's guest is Eric Roper and Darren Evans of Omnestream Entertainment. The two are the biggest fans of Dark Shadows in the city of Louisville and the home of Roger Davis. Also joining us is Dr. Jeff Thompson from Nashville. He is a retired associate professor of English and is taught at Tennessee State University and is the author of The House of Dan Curtis, The Night of Dan Curtis, and The Television Horrors of Dan Curtis. And he is the first repeated guest on the Ghostly Gallery podcast. Welcome, everybody.
Oh, hi, Mark.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have Eric back. He's been on before, and new guests is Darren and Dr. Thompson. And so we're doing this is probably the most people we've had at one time on the show.
Yeah.
And we got one more.
Yeah, one more will be coming. So see one more we can fit in here. It'd be like old college students in a phone booth type of thing. We're going to talk about a very popular supernatural soap opera called Dark Shadows. And I guess I'll start with you and Eric Darren first. I imagine y'all didn't watch Dark Shadows when it first came out on the air.
No.
That
Didn't happen.
Wasn't even born yet.
Yeah.
So,
But I did watch it. I watched in two phases. I watched it one time earlier as a child with my grandmother. And actually, I believe it was the Kate Jackson era when I first got introduced to Dark Shadows. And I was talking to him about it, and that was something that he loved. And I realized it was the same show that he was watching, and he drugged me into watching Dark Shadows.
Go ahead.
I got into Dark Shadows probably like PBS, our local PBS station was showing it in the late 80s. And a friend of mine introduced me. He was watching it, and he introduced me to it. And it was kind of probably about towards the middle of the 1897 storyline. And it was on for about a year, and then the local station dropped it. So I only saw like probably the last part of 1897 and the Leviathan storyline. And then I saw maybe the first part of Parallel Time, and then they took it off, and it took me years to like go back and like be able to see what I was missing.
He ended up getting a box set.
Yeah, I had the coffin set. So
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Thompson, if I remember correctly, you saw that the first episode, September 1st, 1967. Is that correct?
wow.
It was late September of 67. I was late to the party. I hadn't heard of Dark Shadows before. It had been on the air since June of 1966. But in September of 1967, I was homesick from school and turning the channels and ran across a scene of two little kids my age in the cellar of a spooky old house, and there was a coffin in the room. The coffin lid opened, and out came the vampire Barnabas Collins. So from that first scene, I was hooked and watched Dark Shadows until it ended in April of 1971. But it didn't end for me. I continued to read the Gold Key comic books and read Dan Ross's paperback novels and collect all of the memorabilia, the records, the puzzles, games, trading cards, everything. And then as a teenager, I wrote for some Dark Shadows fanzines, about a dozen of them, most notably Kathy Resch's fanzine, The World of Dark Shadows. And I've been enjoying Dark Shadows, studying it, writing about it ever since.
I guess for people who are not familiar with the show, I guess we go back and explain what exactly is Dark Shadows.
It was a daily serial, a soap opera that ran on ABC in the late 60s and early 70s. When it began, it was more like a traditional soap opera, like Peyton Place or The Edge of Night or some other soap operas, because it dealt with romance and family involvements and business and things like that, but with a little hint of mystery and intrigue. There was talk of ghosts, and perhaps some ghosts were heard or seen, and so it went a few steps farther than As the World Turns or most of the soap operas. It was not a rating success, unfortunately. And so ABC told producer-director Dan Curtis, who had created the show with Art Wallace, that the show would be canceled in about 13 more weeks. And Curtis was, of course, crestfallen and wanted the show to continue. And so he was contemplating what he could do to raise the ratings. So at the time, he had 3 young daughters about the age of us kids who were watching the show. And his daughters told him, make it scarier. And he thought to himself, well, what scares me the most? A vampire. So he added the character of the vampire Barnabas Collins about 10 months into the show's run. And that turned the show around, and the ratings skyrocketed. And in 1969, Darren, when you mentioned the 1897 storyline, Dark Shadows commanded 20 million viewers daily. That's Super Bowl ratings in today's TV world. But back then, people were tuning in by the millions to watch Dark Shadows every afternoon, and not just the demographic of the other soap operas. Dark Shadows was very exciting and attractive to all women, men, college students, and elementary school students, and middle school, all ages, and as I think, Eric, you said you watched with your grandmother. That is a key to the success of soap operas and game shows. That's why they've been on the air for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. It's because generations watched together. We watched with our grandmothers and our mothers. And so we have that history with our families, and the simultaneous history of watching these characters on TV for years, or in the case of the longest running soap operas, decades.
Yeah, that's so what was your opinion of the I guess the pre-Barnabas years? Did you feel it was?
I didn't see them until they were released on video by MPI Home Video in the 1990s. And of course, I've watched soap operas all my life, and still watch 3 of the 4 last surviving soap operas on TV. So I was thrilled to see these early episodes and see how it was very much like a typical soap opera of the 60s in terms of the pacing and the conversations and the usual romantic entanglements and family jealousies and business rivalries. But every once in a while, with the sounds of a sobbing, ghostly woman ringing through the halls of Collinwood, or a mysterious locked room in the basement, or lights in the tower, or ghosts on Widow's Hill, or something like that. And then Barnabas Collins was not the first overtly supernatural character on the show. There were some ghosts, the ghost of Josette Collins. And then Diana Millay played Laura Collins, a phoenix fire creature who rose from her own ashes every 100 years. And that really began the rise in the ratings. The show was still in danger and was going to be canceled. But then Dan Curtis decided to top the phoenix fire creature story with the vampire. And the original plan was for this vampire to be just another monster of the week, so to speak, and he would be killed in about 13 weeks. Someone would drive a stake through his heart, and that would be the end, because Dan Curtis and his writers conceived of Barnabas Collins only as a villain, as an evil vampire, or Dan Curtis's word was marauder. And if you watch the very first Barnabas episodes, he does a lot of horrible, terrible, abusive things, as any villain would. But Jonathan Frid, the Canadian Shakespearean actor who played Barnabas Collins so magnetically and brilliantly, became a huge hit with the viewers. And Jonathan Frid told the story of one day Dan Curtis handed him about 5 letters at the studio, and Jonathan thought to himself, oh no, this must be my pink slip. But no, it was fan letters. And then the next week he got about 20 or 30 letters, and the next week 100, and soon it was thousands of letters. He had to get help from some of the fans, some of the viewers, to help him answer all of the fan mail. So Dan Curtis and the writers realized, well, we've struck gold here, but Barnabas can't continue to kidnap and terrorize the women of Collinsport and threaten to kill the little boy and do all of the terrible things that he started out as doing. So Curtis said, well, how can I perpetuate a vampire? So Curtis and the writers came up with the idea, revolutionary in daytime television, of, well, let's take the show back in time to the 1790s when Barnabas was still a mortal man, and let's see how he became a vampire, how he was cursed by the witch Angelique to the living death of vampirism. And through that sequence in the past, we saw Barnabas in a much more sympathetic light. He became a tragic hero. And then when the show went back to the present, by then it was the year 1968, Barnabas was well on his way to becoming the star of the show and the hero of the show. He still was not above biting and even killing some people from time to time, but he had the sympathy of the audience.
I feel that time travel episode was probably what gave like Dark Shadows mythology. You know, when Barnabas was kind of like first introduced, it was almost like a remake of Dracula.
Yes,
But then, like
right.
when they went back in time to see how he became a vampire, it seems like that was when it became Dark Shadows.
Exactly right. Yes, because by that time, Jonathan Frid as Barnabas and Laura Parker were on the show. The show was now in color. It was fully supernatural, with ghosts and vampires, witches, the vampire bat that flies into the through the window and bites Barnabas. So everything except for Quentin, that was the only major missing part at that time. But just about everything you think of when you think of Dark Shadows, time travel, vampires, werewolves, which is not werewolves yet, sorry, had coalesced by then in the 1795 time period, which was on ABC in late 1967 and early 1968. And then in very late 68, when Quentin Collins came on the show and a werewolf began attacking people in Collinsport, then you really had Dark Shadows, and almost all of the year of 1969 was devoted to the 1897 time period, many fans' favorite time period. And that's when the ratings soared to 20 million. And even when Dark Shadows was canceled, it had 12 million viewers. That's what you would get for NCIS or Young Sheldon or something today.
It's weird how times have changed where, like, that's considered like a piddly amount, and going back to the pre-Barnabas years, Eric and Darren, what were your opinions of it? Did y'all watch that?
He hasn't seen those, but I have. It's interesting to me. I think what really holds the early, the pre-Barnabas years together is, I think Mitchell Ryan was a very strong actor as Burke Devlin. I really liked him as the kind of, I guess, sort of an anti-hero.
The dashing rogue, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then of course, Victoria seemed to be a little more proactive during those years in terms of trying to, especially in the Phoenix storyline, she's trying to figure out things, or the ghost of Josette is kind of leading her to things and stuff like that. I feel like her character kind of gets a little bit lost once not so much lost, but I don't feel she's as strong as a character when Barnabas shows up. She kind of can't really figure out anything on her own.
Yeah, especially after the original actress left,
True.
not replaced. The Phoenix story has always kind of puzzled me. I always thought she was more like a fire witch. You know, she didn't really strike me as being like a monster. And I was just wondering, if she was a Phoenix, does that mean David is a half Phoenix, half human thing?
It's
I think
possible.
so.
Yeah.
Well,
Very possible.
he certainly has enough negative energy to be something dark and sinister. So
Yeah, so that was one thing fascinating me. Like kind of like the first like few episodes was how almost like evil David was.
mhm.
And into everything.
Yes. He
Oh,
tries-
yes. At the beginning, both David and Roger were totally unsympathetic.
Yeah, it's like David tries to kill his father by messing with his brakes on his car, and so he was just kind of like a really horrendous person. And
Did we ever see Roger without a drink?
yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
And of course,
Well, a moment ago, you were saying that Victoria Winters later was sort of sidelined. And that's true. All of the human mortal characters, Vicky, Maggie, Carolyn, Elizabeth, Roger, as the story went on, became the victims of the supernatural characters. They didn't have as much to do on their own the way they drove storylines at the beginning, with the mystery around the murder of Bill Malloy, and then Elizabeth's being blackmailed by Jason McGuire, and Roger and Carolyn fighting over the family business when Elizabeth is away. So the human characters became more of the victims of the witch, the warlock, the vampire, the werewolf, and all of the other supernatural elements, Adam and Eve, the Frankenstein-like creations.
there was one actress who got really heavily promoted when Dark Shadows first started. She was almost like the top line, and that was like kind of uses the draw. And there was Joan Bennett.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Yeah, I think Dark Shadows followed the lead of Days of Our Lives, which starred MacDonald Carey, a movie star, in finding a Hollywood movie star to anchor the show. And yes, you're right. Joan Bennett always received star billing, starring Joan Bennett as Elizabeth Cullen Stoddard. Later in 1970, Jonathan Frydd's credit changed to also starring Jonathan Frydd. But Joan Bennett liked to have some time off. She liked to do plays. She was still very active in the theater when she was doing Dark Shadows. And so that's why, Laura Collins put her into a coma, and then she had to go to Wincliffe later, and several times. And once in 1897, she was out of the story, and she was acting in a play at that time whenever she was off the show.
that happened to a lot of cast members. I know, like Jonathan Fritz, he was like put in a coffin for quite some time, and we didn't see him
Yes,
for, like,
well,
several
that
weeks.
was when Jonathan Frydd was filming House of Dark Shadows. During the 1970 parallel time storyline, we didn't see Frydd, who was chained in the coffin, or Grayson Hall, or many of the characters for a long stretch, because they were up in Tarrytown, New York at the Lyndhurst Mansion filming House of Dark Shadows. And essentially, David Selby and Laura Parker were on almost every day. They carried the show because they were not in the first movie, House of Dark Shadows. They starred in the second one, Night of Dark Shadows. But David Selby and Laura Parker essentially carried the show, while Catherine Lee Scott, Grayson Hall, Jonathan Frydd, John Carlin, and others were filming House of Dark Shadows. And then when they finished making the movie, that's when Barnabas escaped from the chained coffin and introduced himself at Collinwood as a cousin, not from England this time, but from South America.
Always convenient. Now, would Barnabas be considered the first American vampire?
Well, no, I think there, some of the Universal movies might have used American vampires, and such as Curse of the Undead, a vampire Western. But I would imagine he is the first major American vampire creation. Dracula, of course, comes from Europe. Although Lon Chaney Jr. and son of Dracula ends up in Louisiana. So who knows about that? But yes, Barnabas Collins is certainly one of the most important American vampires. Yes.
And I think he was one of the first humanized vampires, like, what we were saying earlier about, everybody having sympathy for him.
Yes, exactly. A few of the Universal movies like Dracula's Daughter and House of Dracula did a little bit with that, but and the Wolfman. But yes, today we have so many, guilt-ridden, angst-ridden, reluctant vampires, sympathetic vampires, and that goes back to Barnabas Collins. And Jonathan Frid always said, he said, I wasn't playing a vampire. I didn't play the big bite that everybody wants to see, although that was important. He said, I played the role like an alcoholic, like someone with a secret, someone who had an addiction and had to do things that he didn't want to do. And Jonathan also said, he said to me, the scariest monster is a liar. And that's what Barnabas was too. His whole life at Cullenwood was a lie. But Jonathan said, a liar tells a lie and then he has to perpetuate the lie. And that means he has to tell another lie and another lie and another lie. And then the liar becomes frantic and desperate. And that would lead him to do anything, violence, anything, because he's lying. So those were Jonathan Frid's interpretations of the role. And I think that struck a chord with the viewers because they were seeing something other than just, a movie monster. They were seeing someone who was conflicted and guilt-ridden and had some sympathetic qualities and regretted what he was doing, usually. And I think that's what carried through and allowed the Barnabas character to change from Dan Curtis's idea of the marauder to a sympathetic, tragic hero who carried the rest of the show.
It's almost hard to believe how popular Barnabas, was at that time. He doesn't, he was like getting fan mail on game shows, at shopping mall openings, and even crowned the regional Miss American Vampire Queen, So.
Right. Uh-huh.
We have that to do.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the people who was made a vampire queen was Sakine Littlefeather. And she was the one who went up to the Oscar for Marlon Brando and they accepted it for him. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that was she.
Yeah. And so and of course we mentioned him just a little bit, but there was another popular character in Dark Shadows that gets introduced later on, Quentin Collins. And his, I guess talking about Quentin Collins can be very convoluted at times because when we first meet him, he's a ghost, but then there's time travel involved. And so what are y'all feelings on Quentin?
I'll take that.
I really like the Dorian Gray storyline. Quentin's like one of my favorite characters. Like we had said earlier, where he carried the show. He came in and he kind of became that second. He kind of came that person that everyone liked, other than Barnabas. And I like his storylines from him being the ghost and then it changing over to him being that Dorian Gray and to the werewolf and all of the different iterations that they did with him, So he was a really cool character.
I think one of my favorite was when he made that Stairway to Time. It's like
The 1840.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like it's almost hard to talk about Quentin Collins because you're almost like going, which one are you talking about? So it's like,
Right. There's
Right.
several different ones,
Right.
but they're all kind of the same too.
yeah, they're all the
David
same.
Selby is a terrific guy, a wonderful actor, and he actually is a fan of Dark Shadows. Many actors view their movies and TV shows as just a job. They make the movie or make the TV show and then they move on and forget it. But David Selby actually collected the Dark Shadows memorabilia. I've seen pictures of him posing with the Quentin postcards and the 1897 pinups and all of the pictures of Quentin and the other Dark Shadows actors, because he, from back then and of course still today, was an actual fan of what he was doing. And that is unusual because, sometimes actors just go from one job to another and like it or hate it or love it, but no matter what, it's just off to the next gig. But many of the Dark Shadows performers feel that way. They have a deep connection to the show and to each other. Catherine Lee Scott, certainly. Laura Parker, who died very recently. Marie Wallace, who played Eve, whom we mentioned earlier. So many of the actors, came to the Dark Shadows festivals for decades, essentially because they wanted to be with the fans. They enjoyed meeting the fans or seeing the same fans every year and meeting new ones and signing autographs and in some cases forming real friendships with the fans.
And they've also continued on the mythology, by writing stories and also the audio dramas.
Yes. Laura Parker wrote novels, Angelique's Descent and Big Finish, a company from England that does audio dramas, CD dramas of Doctor Who and many different shows, has done a series of Dark Shadows audio dramas featuring the Dark Shadows actors and a few new characters played by new actors. Even Jonathan Frid appeared in one audio drama before he died, so he did play Barnabas Collins one last time, decades after he played the part on the show and in House of Dark Shadows.
Since this is a Lovecraft podcast, we have to talk about the very puzzling Leviathan storyline. You care to explain that one, Dr. Thompson?
Good luck.
Well, yes. Sadly, the Leviathan storyline was not a hit with most fans and hastened the end of the show, many fans believe. But in the late 1960s and early 70s, interest in the writings of H.P. Lovecraft had resurged. His books were being published, and after Dark Shadows, Night Gallery dramatized some of his stories, and then the movie The Dunwich Horror came out in 1970. But it was just seemingly a coincidence, like Swamp Thing and Man Thing coming out at the same time. I don't think either influenced the other, because the Dunwich Horror had been filmed, months and months before it came out. And it came out in theaters in some places while the Leviathan story was still going on, or in other places after the story had ended. So people, after having seen Rosemary's Baby in the late 1960s and maybe the Dunwich Horror and reading Lovecraft, were becoming aware of some of these horrifying plot devices that Lovecraft perfected. And apparently, obviously, the Dark Shadows writers had read Lovecraft, because so much of the Leviathan story is similar to the Dunwich Horror, only Dark Shadows did not use the idea of twins, but sort of put the two entities together into one in the character of Jeb Hawkes, played by fan favorite Christopher Pinnock, who died about a year or so ago. And then the Dark Shadows used the idea of the child, the baby, growing at a super fast rate. The baby Joseph soon became Alexander, the little boy, and then Michael, the teenager, and finally Jeb. It also could be, a sly comment on on all soap operas aging children very rapidly. The little children are just kids, and then they go away to summer camp or to boarding school, and then they come back teenagers or young adults, because then they can do more in the storyline. So all children on soap operas grow up fast, but not that fast. It was only about 8 weeks from the baby to the boy to the teenager to Jeb Hawks. And Dark Shadows never showed us the real form of Jeb and the Leviathans, probably for budgetary reasons. But, what's left to our imagination is often much more frightening than what we actually see on the screen.
That was kind of my favorite part of the storyline, where they have that room, and we see like a dark outline of something.
Yes, and the heavy breathing.
Yes.
And then when Paul Stoddard or other characters happen to see Jeb in his true form, we didn't see him. The camera just saw the horrified face of the person who was doing the looking. And then once in a while, we saw traces of green slime left on the floor where Jeb in his true form had been. So yes, it definitely was Lovecraftian, but the fans especially did not like the idea of Barnabas turning bad again, turning truly evil, because many of the viewers had never seen Barnabas evil. They had come in late like I did. Maybe they had started watching during 1795 or even 1968, and by then Barnabas was a mostly sympathetic, heroic, but flawed figure. They had missed the part where he, kidnapped Maggie Evans and tried to brainwash her and kept her in the cell in the basement of the old house and all of that. So fans were uncomfortable seeing Barnabas truly evil and also losing his free will, being at the beck and call of the little boy and then of Jeb Hawks. And so that caused the ratings to slide. So the writers had to revamp the story essentially overnight. Dark Shadows never aired live, but a few times, they taped an episode maybe 1 or 2 days before the air date. Usually they were like 2 weeks ahead, but overnight they taped a special episode of mostly just Barnabas and Julia sitting at the fireplace at the old house, and Barnabas confessing to Julia, "This is what has happened to me, that the Leviathans have influenced me. I'm doing their bidding." And because until then, Julia had no idea why Barnabas was acting so distant and cold, and had no further interest in Chris Jennings, whom they both had been trying to cure of his werewolf curse. So the show got Barnabas back on track, at least, by allowing him to regain his free will and start fighting the Leviathans along with Maggie and Julia. But something that occurred to me, and I wrote about this years ago in a fanzine article, I think that the leader of the Leviathans should have not have been Barnabas, but should have been Roger Collins. Louis Edmonds as Roger had nothing to do in that story. He was almost never in it during the Leviathan story. And that would have given Roger something to do, because Roger had the money and the prestige, and he was at the head of the Collins enterprises, and he would have been a more logical choice for someone to lead the Leviathan. So I think the writers missed a real opportunity there, and it would have foreshadowed the evil doings of the Roger Collins of Parallel Time, the story that came after the Leviathans. So unfortunately, the Leviathans, even though it was a well-written story and a lot going on, Angelique married to Sky Rumson, and Sabrina getting the moon poppy to try to cure Chris Jennings, and Julia finding the 1897 artist Charles Delaware Tate still alive in 1970. Many things were going on that were really interesting, but the ratings were dropping, and partially because of the story, but also NBC had started a new soap opera, Somerset, a spinoff of Another World that was on opposite Dark Shadows, and on CBS opposite Dark Shadows were reruns of Gomer Pyle USMC. So those two programs took away some of Dark Shadows viewers, and then the audience was growing up. Perhaps some of the kids who now were early teenagers were losing interest in the show. That never happened to me, of course. I watched it, but I wasn't a teenager. I watched it from age 8 to 12, but I've watched soap operas for decades, so I doubt that any soap opera could cause me to lose interest.
So do you have any idea what would have been the original storyline for Leviathan? Did they have a different ending in mind than what they did?
Well, there was some talk about trying to bring Victoria Winters back. Alexandra Moltke had to leave quickly because she was pregnant and was having, health problems. I wish she could have stayed to wrap up her story, or I know her health was far more important than our TV show, but I wish that the writers had managed somehow to let her last day be the day that she vanishes into the past with Jeff Clark, because as you said, the next two actresses never caught on. But Dan Curtis always wanted her to come back, but Alexandra was not interested in playing Victoria Winters again, or a goody-goody character like that. She wanted to play an Angelique type. She wanted to play a witchy, villainous part. But Curtis said, well, no, the audience wouldn't accept you in that. I think that was a wrong judgment on his part. So that's why in the middle of the Leviathan story, we get the very confusing idea of how the ghost of Peter Bradford with a noose around his neck comes back and haunts Jeb Hawkes and claims that Jeb killed Vicky back in 1797. And then Peter, did I say Jeff Clark? I meant to say Peter Bradford. Peter then pushed Jeb off Widow's Hill and killed him, and then Peter was hanged for the murder. That story came and went in like one episode and didn't go anywhere, but I think Curtis and the writers were hoping to lure Alexandra Moltke back, and who knows what might have happened. Maybe Barnabas would have gone back in time and saved Victoria once again, although he had done that in a very short segue back to 1796. But Curtis felt similarly when Catherine Lee Scott wanted to leave the show in 1970. She had been an original cast member on the very first episode, but another very legitimate, good reason, she was getting married and moving to Europe. But Dan Curtis told her, "You're crazy to leave our show." So he had Maggie Evans's last day on the show being carted off to Wincliffe. She literally went crazy, and Sebastian Shaw drove her to Wincliffe, and that's where she remained until we learned more in those Big Finish audio dramas. So Dan Curtis obviously had very strong feelings about his show and about the people, but it's because he loved the people so much. He readily said, I hired people I liked. He said when Kate Jackson first came on the show, she couldn't even say her own name. But once she got on the show, she became a great actress. So he said, I will hire people I like because I like to work with people I like. And once they get on the show, they can perfect their acting and they can get into the swing of it and they'll be just fine.
Is that why Kate Jackson didn't do any talking when she first appeared?
Maybe so.
Yeah.
It was her very first acting job. And maybe she was easing into it the way David Selby hadn't spoken, for a long time when he was a ghost.
James Storm too, wasn't he?
Oh yes, yeah, James Storm, who began as the ghost of Gerard Stiles, and we didn't hear him speak until the 1840 time period began in late 1970.
That's such an interesting effect. You see these people, especially with Quentin, you feel like that he is talking, but you just can't hear it. Like you're watching like a TV show with the volume turned off when he's.
Yes, he talked over the antique telephone to David and Amy, and then I think the way he stared at them sometimes he was speaking with them telepathically.
Yeah, I thought that was a really cool effect. There are like millions and millions of other storylines when it comes to Dark Shadows. Is there another favorite y'all have from Dark Shadows?
I think my favorite is probably the 1795 story. Just because it kind of gives you a little backstory into Barnabas. And to me, it's probably one of the most concise storylines that Dark Shadows had. There's a very definite beginning, middle, end. I think a lot of times on Dark Shadows, like they come up with some really good ideas and they have great beginnings. And then they kind of really don't know how to end the story. So it just kind of meanders. And then it's just like, oh, we got to move on to something else. And so they kind of wrap everything up really quick and move on to the next big story. But that's just me. But I think 1795 is a very strong. I mean, there's other storylines that I like. I pretty much like the only period I really don't care for is kind of the period with Adam and the Dream Curse. I don't really care much for that period of the show. But they're all for the most part pretty good.
Yeah, in my three books about producer director Dan Curtis, I say that 1795 is one of the greatest stories ever told on television. I really believe that, and it's Shakespearean, it's Wagnerian, it's heavy emotional drama, and it was in the 1991 revival of Dark Shadows too. But you're right, some of the stories you can tell the writers had thought and planned from the beginning to the end. 1795 is like that, 1840, 1970 parallel time. But then you're right, in other instances, the Adam, Eve, Nicholas story seems to stall and go on for far too long. It takes far too long for Eve to be created. And then once Eve Marie Wallace is created and comes to life, she's not on the show long enough before she dies. And then that story just ends very abruptly. Professor Stokes tells Adam that he's going to send him to Boston to have plastic surgery on his face, and we never see him again. Barnabas and Julia mention Adam and Eve a couple more times during the show, but the idea of a link between Barnabas and Adam is completely dropped. And then 1897 lasted for 9 months, and you perhaps could see that it was like two different stories, because by a certain point, many of the actors, like Catherine Lee Scott and Roger Davis, had been killed. Their characters had been killed off, but then they came back as other characters. Thayer David, of course. And it was because the ratings were so high and the show was booming and was such a big success that the writers decided, well, let's just stay in 1897 longer. So that's when, Catherine Lee Scott became Kitty Hampshire and Roger Davis became Charles Delaware Tate. And of course, Thayer David stopped playing Sandor and became Count Petofi. So, and then you've heard the story, perhaps, that the writers themselves would get confused sometimes. Even the writers couldn't keep it all in their head about what had happened. to the characters and when. And there is a story of the writers going out to the stage door where all of the kids gathered to meet the stars and asked the kids, what happened to this character, or what did we do back then? You know, how did it end? Because every day school kids gathered at the stage door, you know, to get autographs from Laura Parker and Jonathan Frid and the stars, and take home movies of them, and certainly take still pictures of them, or take home movies of them, the stars walking down the street, getting into their cabs. So all of us are fanboys, so of course we remember almost everything that happens in a comic book or a soap opera or a TV show or a novel. So we are the ones to ask.
What about you, Eric?
I'm gonna say I really don't have a favorite storyline, but I really like the interactions between Barnabas and his lackeys, Ben and Julia and Willie, where they always act as his conscious to sometimes disastrous results. You know, like Willie being caned. But you know, I you know, and seeing that interaction throughout all of those different storylines is something that always engaged me. And plus, you know, anytime Angelique shows up, you know, you can ask him. I'm just glued to the set.
There is a certain stage presence with Angelique, you know, you just
yes. Yes.
And she was one of the few, like I call like an original character. She didn't seem like she was based on someone, you know, she seemed very original from the very beginning. And
she had very mesmerizing eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And when she really got into her, you know, her mode, her moments, I mean, they were just tantalizing. I really loved it. I mean, she really played a very conflicted, you know, she was evil, but she was very conflicted and she was very much in love. So I really think that Laura Parker handled that very well. It's awesome.
Oh, yes. Laura was wonderful and really did play that scorned woman part. And in the 1897 storyline, you remember when Angelique and Barnabas are in the tower room and Angelique puts her head on his shoulder and said, oh, Barnabas, I love you so much. But it was not until much later that Barnabas could return any kind of feelings for her. Laura Parker auditioned for the part of Victoria Winters. So did Nancy Barrett, but neither one of them would have been right for Victoria Winters. But Dan Curtis and Leela Swift, the director, remembered Laura Parker and brought her back to play the part that she was born to play. And when she started, she perhaps overdid the sympathy or the emotion, because Jonathan Frid took her aside one day and said, you're the heavy. You have the plum role on this show. You're the witch. You're the villain. So you're not the heroine. So don't play it like that. You're the heavy. You're going to make things happen. You're going to make bad things happen to all of us. So play it like that. And so she did.
It was good advice for her. There are a lot of other characters and people, and it's interesting that, you know, so many actors played so many characters, and there's a very repertory theater going on there.
Yes.
Grayson Hall is definitely great as Dr. Hoffman.
I love Julia Hoffman. She is one of my favorite characters, and I, of course, always wished that she and Barnabas could have fallen in love and been a couple, because Julia, of course, loved him, but Barnabas saw her only as a friend.
I think Barnabas only seemed to have like eyes just for one person. That was Josette.
Yeah. or
Roxanne.
Reminded him of Josette, Maggie, Vicky, Rachel, Kitty, Roxanne. Yes.
And one of my favorite characters has got to be Nicholas Blair / Evan Hanley.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Humbert Allen Estreto.
Yeah, that was like almost like I guess like the devil himself coming, you know, to like, you know,
I wish I had a queen card right here for you.
Yeah.
Right, the Queen of
See
Spades.
this, you'll know what to do.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Humbert Allen Estreto was marvelous in the way he played his part, so courtly and charming and gentlemanly, and yet he was one of the most dangerous people on the whole show, certainly one of the most wickedly powerful, until he got his comeuppance. But then even he came back during the Leviathan story. That was another one of the pluses of the Leviathan story, although he didn't stay around long enough and didn't really do much in that time period. But at least we got to see Nicholas again. And then you're right, he was Evan Hanley in 1897, and then the lawyer Charles Dawson in 1840.
I kind of thought they were all the same person, but just under different names.
Perhaps.
And I'm going to mispronounce his name. Thayer David.
Yeah, Thayer David.
One
of the best actors on the show, yes. What?
Do you have a favorite character of his he played?
Well, I love Professor Stokes. I like the present day actors the best, I believe. But he was wonderful in all of the roles he played, and every single one was so different. Matthew Morgan, in the pre-Barnabas episodes, if you have seen those, as the surly caretaker of Collinwood, and then the learned, urbane Professor Stokes was so different, and then Ben Stokes was different yet again in 1795, and then in 1840 we see a very old Ben Stokes. So, and then of course Count Petoffy and Timothy Stokes, father of Angelique and Alexis in Parallel Time. So, yes, I think Thayer David and Nancy Barrett played more roles than just about anybody else, and were two of the finest actors on the show. All of them are great actors. David Selby, Catherine Lee Scott, James Storm, all of them. But Thayer David really, lit up the screen whenever he came on as anything, as Professor Stokes, or even some of the characters who were in it for just a very few episodes, like his character in 1840, or Timothy Stokes, who got into the swing of things at the end of 1970 Parallel Time and started a big fire.
Petoffy's probably.
I want to know what his character did to Adam. What did he do to Adam? What happened to Adam? He put him in that back room.
Yes. That was in December of 1968, and Stokes said to Adam, I know a doctor friend in Boston who does plastic surgery, and he can remove those scars, and I will send you there. But then someone knocked on the door, and he told Adam to go into the other room, and then you're right, we never ever saw him again. Barnabas and Julia mentioned Adam and Eve a couple of times, like when they found Roxanne, near death, and tried to revive her in a similar way, or when Julia, possessed by Judah Zachary, tried to do that to Judah Zachary's body in 1840. But yes, Adam was on the show for so long, and we saw a good character arc of him going from, like just essentially a baby to an educated man, but very conflicted. He literally had an angel and a devil on his shoulders, because Professor Stokes was trying to teach him manners and ethics, and Nicholas Blair was undoing all of that. He was telling him all the wrong things. You need to lie. You need to be dominant and show your power over these people. You need to take advantage. So Adam was a very interesting character. You're right, some fans got tired of him because that story did seem to last too long, and then didn't have a satisfying wrap up. But about 6 months after the show ended, Sam Hall, one of the writers of Dark Shadows and the husband of Grayson Hall, wrote an article for TV Guide called "Here's What Really Happened to Barnabas and Company." And you can find it online or look it up. And Roger Davis reads parts of the article on one of the Dark Shadows DVDs and VHS tapes. But Sam Hall says that Carolyn meets Adam again later in her life, but they, quote, part good friends. And I was thrilled to hear that Barnabas and Julia do end up together, that he falls in love with her, and they marry and move to Singapore, of all places, in an attempt to escape the reach of Angelique. So yeah, look up that article. Now, it's most fans accept it more or less. Some take it with a grain of salt. Some say, well, no, it's not canon. But I tend to believe it because Sam Hall wrote it. So it's what he was planning to do, at least at the moment when he wrote the article. And I was glad that he took the time to resolve the stories for us fans, because speaking of another unsatisfying ending, we stopped seeing our people, so to speak, the people from our time and our world, in January of 1971, a couple of months before the show ended. That's when Barnabas, Julia, and Stokes walked back up Quentin's stairway through time and came back to 1971 and saw that everything was peaceful and they had averted the disaster and the ghost of Gerard was gone. And so that's the last we saw of them. Dark Shadows ended so abruptly and ended in 1841 parallel time with none of our people involved. In all of the other trips through time, at least one of our people from our world was involved. Vicky or Barnabas or Julia or even Eve went back in time briefly, or Stokes went back in time. I also have written in the past that I wish that when Barnabas and Julia went back to the present time, Stokes could have stayed behind in 1840 and crossed over into 1841 parallel time. And that way we would have had one of our people involved in that last two or 2.5 month long story, which as it was totally detached from Dark Shadows. And, I guess we can say, well, these are the ancestors of Quentin and his son and the people we saw in 1970 parallel time. But it would have been much more satisfying if on that last show we could have seen our characters again. But by that time, Jonathan Frid had tired of playing Barnabas Collins. He kind of was turned off by the movie House of Dark Shadows. He thought it was too violent and had tired of playing Barnabas, and so that's why a new character was created for him. So probably Jonathan had said, I don't want to go back and play Barnabas again on the last episode. Let's just keep it as it is. And it's possible that the show was slated to last until June of 71, making it a full 5 years. They knew the show was being canceled by January of 71, but at first the plan was to let it go until June, but then ABC decided, well, no, let's cut it off now and let's stop that on April 2nd. And so that's why 1841 parallel time does seem kind of rushed, and it also just sort of wraps up very abruptly, and even a final voiceover narration from Thayer David tells us what happens to those characters, but not our people from our world. So it was sort of abrupt, and David Selby missed the last 2 or 3 weeks of the show because he had appendicitis. He didn't get to be on the show at the very end. So in those last few episodes, Quentin Collins was always out walking on the grounds or getting the horses ready, or he took a trip to Boston. So unfortunately, we didn't get to see David Selby at the end of the show.
Just so unsatisfying.
Yes.
I have a question for the doctor. Do you think that the movie kind of hurt the show?
I think so, because it's a great movie. It's one of the best vampire movies of the 1970s. But it was not what we watched every afternoon on Dark Shadows. It was Dan Curtis's original idea of let's make Barnabas just an evil, bloodthirsty monster, and he's going to kill everybody and turn people into vampires, and all we can do is drive a stake through his heart, and that's it. And so I think maybe parents who took their children to see House of Dark Shadows were shocked by all of the bloodletting and the staking and the killings and everything. And maybe that turned off a lot of the parents, and they didn't like the idea of their kids continuing to watch the show. So there were many factors, that led to the cancellation of the show. Economics, certainly, because even though Dark Shadows still at the end had 12 million viewers, so many of them were kids my age back then, or teenagers, and they were not the ones with the money and the purse strings who went out and bought the soap and shampoo and detergent that were advertised on the show. So demographically, the show was not succeeding in selling the products that soap operas sell. And then I think some of the actors were beginning to tire, and the writers were exhausted because they had used up essentially every story idea except a mummy. A mummy was in the Dark Shadows comic book and in one of Dan Ross's paperback novels and in one or two of the Big Finish audio dramas. But the writers had started repeating themselves, ghosts haunted Collinwood and possessed the children 2 times, and Quentin was buried alive 2 times, and Barnabas was bricked up 2 times after having bricked up Reverend Trask, Cask of Amontillado style. So so there, it was beginning to repeat itself the way Bewitched and other stories that had, genre type gimmick premises did. But I liked it until the very end. I love 1840 and even 1841 Parallel Time. Yes, 1795 is one of the show's finest hours. It's Barnabas's story, while 1897 is Quentin's story, and 1840 to a certain extent is Angelique's story, because we learn who she was, that she was Miranda centuries ago, and was involved with Judah Zachary. We saw that one episode that flashed back to what year was it?
1695, wasn't it?
1680 or 1692, I believe. The show loved the 90s, 1795, 1897, 1995, 2 of my favorite weeks on the show. So yeah, and then that one episode in 1841 Parallel Time that flashes back to 1680 when Brutus Collins, we see what happened that made Brutus Collins curse the family. So and then we saw a brief flashback to 1949, when Elizabeth thought she had killed her husband, and again in the Leviathan story when Paul Stoddard meets the mysterious Mr. Strack at the Blue Whale in 1949 and makes a deal with him that he will give him his most prized possession. And then, later in a scene at the Blue Whale, Barnabas, when he was still in his evil mode, was there with Paul Stoddard and Carolyn and said very cruelly, "Yes, Mr. Stoddard, she's your most prized possession."
You found it ironic, or I guess odd, that the mystery that started off Dark Shadows, Victoria Winters trying to figure who her parents were, was never resolved or revealed throughout the entire series.
Yes. Many fans believe that Vicky was Elizabeth's daughter. Some think she was Paul Stoddard's daughter. And then for a while, Vicky went to Sam Evans's house and saw a painting of a woman who looked just like her, Betty Hanscom, but that really didn't go anywhere. And but a fan visited Joan Bennett a few years before she died and made a video of Joan Bennett saying, "Yes, Victoria Winters was my daughter." So that isn't really canon, but many of the fans take it as canon because Joan Bennett said it, and you can't argue with Joan Bennett. If Elizabeth said it, so it's so.
Do you agree with that, though?
Well, I think the show was leaning in that direction. You know, why else would Elizabeth want to bring Vicky to Collinwood and keep her there? And who was sending the $50, you know, every week or month to the foundling home? But yeah, that is another missed opportunity. And if Alexandra Moltke had stayed on the show, and or any Victoria Winters character had stayed central to the story, we might have learned that eventually. But in 1841 parallel time, at least Melanie learned who what her true parentage was. You know, 1841 parallel time was very much like the beginning of the show in that the supernatural elements were downplayed. Yes, we had the ghost of Brutus Collins, but most of it was much more soap operatic. You know, Catherine's pregnancy, Melanie's parentage, Daphne's terminal illness. So at the end, it became what it had started out as more of a typical daytime drama with romance and love and jealousy and things like that, but with the supernatural thrown in as well.
And jumping back to some of the characters who've been there, I think one of my favorite actors, had to give a shout out to a Kentuckian, Roger Davis. You know,
Oh, yes.
Came from Louisville. He played a lot of characters too.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Charles Delaware Tate and Dirk Wilkins, a scary vampire.
Yeah.
And of course, Jeff Clark and Peter Bradford and Ned Stewart and many. So yes, he is a fan favorite and is always popular when he appears at Dark Shadows fan events.
He was one of those actors I see
very
a lot.
handsy.
What was that?
So I said, and very handsy.
Yes, I've heard people on Facebook say that about many of the men on the show, that at least by today's standards, they were very handsy in the way they manhandled the women sometimes.
I'd say he took it to another level.
Yeah.
Well, he told a story one time that he got so rough with Joan Bennett that he knocked her down. Yeah.
Wow. I'm curious about Willie Loomis, because when he first started off, he was played by a different actor named James Hall.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, abruptly, he's changed and, you know, played by someone else. Do you know what the story is behind that?
Well, a lot of fans have said James Hall as the first Willie Loomis is the scariest thing ever on the show. You know, he's the scariest monster of all because his scenes were really scary in a real life way. The way he, you know, cornered Vicky and Carolyn, and it was a very uncomfortable, you know, like a molestation or an attempted rape if it had gone on farther. So that I'm sure was very scary to viewers, young and old. But you know, many of the characters at the beginning changed. There was, you know, a first Sam Evans before David Ford, and a different Matthew Morgan before Thayer David, and three different Dr. Woodards. So I think the decision was made to take Willie in a different direction because, you know, in just another episode or two, Willie was going to open the chained coffin and release Barnabas, and then was going to have to play the very, you know, cowed, beaten down, almost PTSD-like victim of Barnabas. And maybe the producers thought that this first actor couldn't have pulled that off as well because he was such a strong personality. And of course, John Carlin made the part his own and is definitive in the part and is a strong personality too. But the way he started out, he was under Barnabas's power and terribly abused by Barnabas. Barnabas beat him with the cane on the TV show and in House of Dark Shadows. But as the show went on, Willie came into his own and became a huge fan favorite, because I think the fans identified with him because he wasn't a vampire, he wasn't a warlock, he was mortal, he was human, he was like your next door neighbor, he was any man or every man, and anything could happen to him. He could die at any minute. And so we weren't sure whether he was going to stay in the story the whole time, or is he going to get killed off by one of the monsters or Adam or somebody. So I think we identified with him and the other mortal characters as well. We're like those characters, and we're not as much like Nicholas and Adam and Eve and all of the monsters who terrorize them.
There is another villain I really liked from the show, the first Reverend Trask, I have to say, in particular.
Oh, Jerry Lacey was fantastic. He was born to play Reverend Trask. I'm in all of his iterations of the part, but especially the first one. He really came on the show and took it by storm. And then, of course, he built on the part when he played Gregory Trask in 1897 and got an unusual comeuppance from Judith Collins Trask. And then I liked Tony Peterson, his present time character, who's sadly, here again, another blown opportunity. Tony Peterson just faded out of the story and was never heard from again, after Adam saw him kissing Carolyn, and then when he helped Julian Stokes have the seance that revealed the skeleton of Trask, I think those were his last appearances, and then we just never saw him again. But that great scene with Laura Parker as Cassandra with the lighter, the cigarette lighter that went out, but she really got it back immediately. She got that flame back in a split second and continued to hypnotize him. And some of the very best Big Finish audio dramas are the Tony and Cassandra mysteries. It was almost like a heart-to-heart type of thing, a supernatural heart-to-heart, in that Tony and Cassandra solved mysteries together and had great chemistry, on the show, and especially on these Big Finish audio dramas, where they really perfected their characters and their banter and their chemistry. But yes, Jerry Lacey was marvelous. And I liked Lamar Trask, too, in 1840. And even Trask the butler in Parallel Time.
The other characters you'd like to talk about that you feel need to be worth mentioning?
Oh, we could go on forever. All of them were just fantastic. We've mentioned Nancy Barrett, Thayer David, Catherine Lee Scott, David Selby, James Storm, Christopher Pennock, Marie Wallace, Robert Rodan as Adam, who never came back and played another part like Alexandra Moltke. He was only one character, and that was it. But all of the actors on the show were fantastic, because so many, Louis Edmonds, because so many of them were stage actors. And I think that gave a theatrical, melodramatic, larger-than-life air to the show. This wasn't a soap opera where, the people are sitting at the coffee table talking calmly about, I'm getting a divorce, or I think he's cheating. It was magnified and exaggerated almost to the point of a stage performance, with vocal inflections and mannerisms and larger than life characters. And then so many of the actors continued on other soap operas. Louis Edmonds was on All My Children for years, and Nancy Barrett and so many others showed up on. Donna Wandry, who played Roxanne, showed up on other soap operas, and even a few of the pieces of the set of Dark Shadows showed up on Ryan's Hope, which was a soap opera that was taped in the same studio after Dark Shadows ended. Ryan's Hope used the mausoleum set as the front hall of a church. And I believe One Life to Live used the parallel time room for a while, which was one of the most striking sets on the show. I wonder where all of those sets are now. I guess they just don't exist anymore. But I wish the great hall of Collinwood, the entrance hall and the drawing room could have been preserved, but who knows what happened to all of them. The head of Judah Zachary ended up in an antique shop in New York City.
Wow.
I would like to own that. That's just a very distinct, head, I have to say. David and Richard, y'all have not really seen Dark Shadows, the series. Y'all have any comments to make about it?
I've seen the movie one that's again was kind of the compressed version, which you say was his original, design, for that. And then I've read about the Lovecraftian, the Leviathan storyline. And I'm wondering, as far as, did you think that if they had handled, I guess, the way that they kind of sidelined Barnabas to press these new characters into there, it would have been better received, that taking your hot character and kind of diminishing him and making him the henchman for these like new characters was,
yes, absolutely.
Serialized fiction, that's usually a bad idea, to try to get your new hot character over by having him steamroll the existing ones. And then people are like, I don't like this new guy, and I don't like seeing someone that I'd seen previously be this strong, independent character suddenly go yes master to some new guy that just showed up.
Exactly. That's exactly what many of the fans found fault with and were disappointed with in the Leviathan story. And so that's why the writers realized, well, we've got to stop this and we've got to let Barnabas be good again. He can't be hitting people with his car, as he did to Quentin, and he can't be taking orders from the little boys. He has to become Barnabas.
That would seem
again.
As far as that there was this kind of emasculating type of he's being a order.
Yes, and he had to reunite with Julia. Yes, he had to reunite with Julia so that the two of them could fight the Leviathans together, along with Maggie and a few others who could not be taken over by the Leviathan. Some people could not be.
And of course, one other thing that Dark Shadow is known for is like its goofs and errors that popped up, here.
Yes. There's a whole MPI home videotape now on DVD of bloopers of the show, of, the wall shaking or a gravestone falling over, or the boom mic or the cameras coming into the picture, and flubbed lines and everything like that. But I think that just adds to the charm and the immediacy of the show, because Dark Shadows was never live, but it was performed as if it were. ABC gave the cameras to Dark Shadows for just that 30-minute window before the cameras went to the next studio to do the afternoon news and evening news. And so they, except for just a few times when something just drastically bad happened, they stopped. But usually, especially in the early years, they went straight through, no matter what happened. They treated it like a live stage play, and all of the actors had experience in that. And so if they flubbed a line, or if somebody forgot a line, another actor perhaps gave him or her the line, or if the blinds fell down off the window, they just kept talking, or if we heard hammering in the background sometimes for some reason, but the actors just continued. So there were just a couple of times that they stopped, but it was very expensive to do that back then, because back then, in order to edit the videotape, you had to take a razor blade and cut the videotape. It was not computerized in any way, and that involved, paying studio time to send an editor into a studio to cut up the tape. There's a scene in 1795 where Jonathan Frid felt that he just blew it, and he begged Dan Curtis to let him do it again, and so they did. But then as the show went on and it became much more technically complex, like when Angelique and Alexis saw each other, they were in the same shot, and the stairway through time and all of that. They did stop the tape a few times then, and sometimes you can see, kind of a jump or an obvious stopping place. But by then, by 1970 and 71, I think editing techniques had advanced, and maybe it was a little bit easier. But at the beginning, they were doing live theater, and Catherine Lee Scott says, "Oh, sometimes others and I would beg Dan Curtis, oh, please let us do it again. We can do it better." And Dan Curtis said, "Forget about it. This is going to be seen one time, and it'll never be seen again." Now, I don't think maybe he himself truly believed that, because he had the great foresight to keep all of the tapes. You've heard how so many of the soap operas, especially the Procter and Gamble soap operas, As the World Turns, The Edge of Night, Another World, Search for Tomorrow, really don't exist until about 1978, because the tapes were reused. They were the soap operas were considered so disposable and so one time only that the networks would just use the same videotape over and over again, as we would tape over shows that, and if we wanted to tape something new on our VCR. But luckily, Dan Curtis saved every tape, every episode. All 1,225 episodes exist except one. But luckily, a fan up in Canada tape recorded the episode, and so we have the sound. And so it's an 1841 parallel time episode. And when you get to that near the end of the show on the DVDs or the VHS, you hear the soundtrack, and then Jim Pearson of MPI Home Video and Dan Curtis Productions put still pictures together, that matched what was happening on the show that day. And so that's how you see that one episode. But I don't know why that episode, that tape ended up blank or whatever, but it's a minor miracle in that day and age that all of the episodes except one still exist. Some only in kinescope form, the fuzzier, blurrier black and white films that were made of the videotape. But thank goodness for the kinescopes, because we get to see the whole 5 years of the show, whereas so many of the other shows, like Guiding Light and Love of Life and The Edge of Night, really don't exist, except maybe a wedding episode or a courtroom episode here and there that somebody happened to save. But you can't really see a straight run of those shows until about 1978 or the 80s.
People didn't have the ideas of the syndication or streaming in mind back then.
Right, yes. And because soap operas never did reruns back then, and almost never do today, people thought, well, it's a soap opera. It's new every day. It continues. So why would you go back and look at one from 3 years ago or 10 years ago? It wouldn't make sense. But we, of course, want to see all of them.
And for the episode, the word of the episode for this one is or actually it's the phrase is blue whale. So what does blue whale mean in Dark Shadows? Y'all care help to define what blue whale means?
To me, it's the hangout spot where all the characters meet.
It was originally it was going to be called the Rainbow Bar, but it ended up being changed, and apparently it's been around for a long, long time in the Dark Shadow universe. It was originally called the Eagle.
Yes, and it is the Eagle in 1795 and in 1970 parallel time.
And according to Burt Devlin, it had the best lobster in the world. And
yes, it was a wonderful set. In the early day, of course, we saw the blue whale throughout the whole show. We stopped seeing the Collinsport Inn coffee shop, but especially in the early days of the show, when the show was centered more around the mortals, the humans, that those two sets were great gathering places for, as writer Ron Sproat called them, the downtown crowd. Maggie's father, Joe Haskell, the people who lived in Collinsport. And so we got to see them at the Blue Whale and at Maggie's coffee shop. But I think after Barnabas appears, we see the coffee shop just one more time. That's the place where Barnabas meets Maggie and accidentally leaves his cane. And then Joe and Maggie return the cane to him. But then I think that's the last time we ever see that set. And of course, we never see the kitchen breakfast room set from the pre-Barnabas episodes after Barnabas arrives. We see a small kitchen in one 1970 Parallel Time episode, but other than that, we never see the kitchen or that very nice dining room or breakfast room set that was in many of the pre-Barnabas episodes, with the big windows and the potted plants and a kitchen on the side of it, because the show was moving away from literal kitchen sink drama, which soap operas were at the time, and becoming much more plot driven as opposed to character driven. The people on the show didn't have time to eat or sleep because something was happening every minute.
I guess when you're a vampire, the dark alley is your kitchen.
Right. Uh-huh.
And they had like one bartender, seems like, for the Blue Whale. It was like Bob Rooney.
Mm-hmm.
And the jukebox only had like 2 songs on it the entire time.
Right. Robert Cobert. We haven't mentioned him, and we need to mention him. His music makes the show. There are a few shows like Batman and Downton Abbey where the music is a character. The music is as much a part of the show as the people on it. And as soon as you hear that music, The Odd Couple, as soon as you hear that music, you know what show you're watching. And Robert Cobert did such a great job with all the scary music and all of the different music cues, and then the songs that he did for the Blue Whale, and then later Quentin's theme and Ode to Angelique and pieces of music like that. But yeah, the much of the mood and atmosphere of the show is because of Robert Cobert, who composed music for almost all of Dan Curtis's 4 productions over the years. There are just a handful that Cobert did not compose music for.
It seems like when a director finds a good, music director, he's going to keep them alone. And Sam, who's one of our big listeners here, found a Dark Shadow book for me one time at a yard sale.
A Dark Shadows what?
He found me a Dark Shadows book. It was called Barnabas Collin in a
Book?
Funny Vein.
Yes, the joke book.
Yes, the joke book. And so I thought I would end with some of the jokes from there.
Oh, God. Entire day.
Yes. Who is Barnabas' favorite cowboy?
Who?
Gene Artery.
Oh boy.
This is one of the bad ones here. I mean, this is like really terrible. And it's like, why did Barnabas get thrown out of the Navy?
He couldn't cross water.
Yeah, that'd be a funnier punchline. He tattooed a chest on his ship. Yeah, there are plenty of them and all that. So, as wrapping up, Eric and Darren, do you have anything you want to promote?
Not right now.
Not right now.
You want to promote your website or anything? You're still working on that?
Yeah, Omnestream.com, fantasyunderground.com. Come and check out the stories.
Right. And Dr. Thompson, you got plenty of books. You working on anything new?
I've written some chapters for some recent books about fans' memories of watching Dark Shadows back then and running home from school to watch Dark Shadows. But my 3 books about producer-director Dan Curtis are The Television Horrors of Dan Curtis, House of Dan Curtis, and then a fan told me, well, if you've written House of Dan Curtis, you're going to have to write Night of Dan Curtis. So I wrote Nights, plural, of Dan Curtis, all about Curtis's great epic productions that we spent nights watching, like The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, and his great adaptation of Dracula, and his one and only Western, and one of his favorites of his movies, The Last Ride of the Dalton Gang, and his UFO miniseries, Intruders, They Are Among Us. But I cover all 46 of his productions in all 3 of the books, but each book focuses on a different area, the horror productions, of course, and then the mysteries and crime dramas, and then the epics, the big shows like the 2 World War II miniseries and the great adaptation of Dracula. And those are available at Amazon.com. All of them are in brand new revised second editions. So I keep learning more and more about Dan Curtis, and so I did revised new editions of the 3 books, and I'm very excited about those.
They're very well researched, I have to say.
Well, thank you.
All right, and one last note, David, your other podcast, The Pattern is Full. I was honored to be the first guest on there, and I'm talking about the ghost stories and legends around Logan County, and y'all can listen to that one. And so. Cool. So we'll wrap it up. We'll see the stars are no longer right. We must cease all discussions to align again next month. 30+ minutes with H.P. Lovecraft is sponsored by the Our Nemnesky Neighborhoods. That's the wrong list. I did it all wrong and all that. Anyway, we're just in it right now. Bye-bye, folks.
That's a blooper. It's an outtake.
Yes.
It's an outtake.
You know, my blooper for this one.
Yeah, that's a Dark Shadows blooper.
Yeah.
You planned that. You planned that.